Here is Pennonia Young Wine, and as a red by name, it was expecting more of a Bordeaux. What I got was a red with a very slight purple lean, very slight. You can see it in the chromatography up at the top, a slight bit of light blue there causing it. This is a solid performer. As papers changes, the tone stays the same, very consistently nice. It does shade across all papers, which generally isn't my thing for red inks, but this does it well. On non-fountain pen friendly paper, it performs just as well as on the premium papers, making this perfect for students and teachers alike. Now, while I already have my go-to red, and I would be very happy to have a bottle of this and not just use it for grading, but also some of my own primary notes. So this would be a good bottle for me.
The pen for today is a Pelikan M120. And now that we know my opinion on this ink, let's see how we got there by looking at the first writing sample done on Clairfontaine.
We get a lovely red on this bright white paper with no feather, with no spread, with very pronounced shading. Not a common thing for red inks, but very pronounced, very well done, really looking excellent on the page. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting.
Pennonia makes more than just one ink. Let's take a look at a few other inks from Pennonia.
Here is Pennonia Mustvoros. Here is Pennonia Kekfeni Blue Light.
The second writing sample is done in a Portage Reporter notebook.
Here we get the same tone as the Clairfontaine. It does not feather, does not spread. It does shade, though not as well as it did on the Clairfontaine. It still does shade very well. Take a look at cases on the third line. Where the C is a nice midtone, it lightens up into the AS with a very dark ES at the end. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting.
There's a lot to be learned by doing multiple chromatographies. The one on the left is done the way it's supposed to be done. A line of ink is put down to immediately put into water to show the separation of those colors, making the ink. Now the one on the right is marked with a D. This is allowed to dry for 10 minutes before it's put into water. The third writing sample is done in a national brand Steno notebook.
Here we get the same tone as the Clairfontaine. It does not feather, does not spread. It does still shade very nicely. I think it shades much more in the print style writing than in the cursive style writing, something to be aware of depending on how you write. But it does shade in the cursive. Look at therefore, where the TH is nice and dark, the ER lighten up a little bit, the EF get much darker, OR lightening up a little bit with a dark E at the end. I don't think this is being affected by the tone of the paper, meaning what we have is a more opaque ink. Looking at the back of the page, we have no bleeding, no ghosting, though there's only a couple of spots that it got a little deeper into the page. I do not believe that would stop you from writing back here.
Resistance tests are done to see how well this ink can be expected to perform on the page, and more importantly, how hard it may be to clean from your pen. Now, the smear is allowed to dry for 3 days before testing it. In the upper left, you can see where there is highlighter. In the upper right, that is pen flush. The lower left has a 1/3 bleach solution, and the lower right has plain old water. The next writing sample is done in a Rhodia notebook.
Here we get the same tone as the Clairfontaine. It does not feather, does not spread, does shade just as well as it does on the Clairfontaine, and most importantly, stands out against the quad rule without any kind of a problem. So a good ink to use if this is the paper you go for. Looking at the back of the page, no bleeding and no ghosting.
With over 1,000 inks reviewed, let's take a look at a few more red inks.
Here is Ackerman, their number 19. Here is Diamine Matador. Here is Kaweco Ruby Red. Here is Noodler's Rabok Red.
All of the inks that you just saw have a review here on the channel. Now, the next writing sample is done in a Composition Lab notebook.
Here we get the same tone as the Clairfontaine. This paper will normally make it lighter and flatter, and it does not do that in this case, showing we have a really very strong ink. No feather, no spread, still shades, though not as pronounced as on some of the other papers. Doing a great job, standing out against the quad rule without any problem, being a very good ink to use if you're a student using this. Keep up the good work. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting.
While it's nice to see inks that are in the same color family, I prefer to find inks that complement the color on the page.
Here is Pilot Mixable Blue-Black.
Here is Aurora Gray.
Here is Krishna Cool Breeze. Here is Sailor Cairo Duro.
The best way you can support this or any channel that you like watching is to alert the retailer of where you saw the product at time of purchase. Now, the last writing sample is done on 20-pound copy paper.
Here we get the same tone as the Clairfontaine. It doesn't feather, barely spreads at all. I'm going to take back the doesn't feather. I see it a little bit in some of the print style writing, not as much really in the cursive style writing. So it does have a little bit of feathering, not a huge deal. It does have a normal amount of spread. This does look fairly decent here. Just noticing, I don't know that this is one I go for because the feathering is just starting to draw my eye much more than it did any time before, but I'm being overly picky. This probably is a very good ink to use on this paper. Looking at the back of the page, we see there's no real problem with the ghosting of the writing. The print writing, it gets much deeper into the page, much more frequently, never bleeding through to touch the page underneath, but you could not write on the back of the page using this ink.
So what nib and pen do I think are going to give the best writing experience with this ink?
The Pelikan M120 Fine is a wet writing pen that gives a great red with slight purple lean and a very consistent amount of shading. Off camera, I tried this in a dry medium, and the tone lightened just a little bit, and the shading increased. The lighter tone just seemed a little less special to me as a red. So for me, I keep this in a slightly darker red with a slight purple lean, and the shading you've seen. I go for a wet pen of any standard nib size.